All right, finally. Praise be to the Most High, giving thanks to the Creator for this opportunity once again to have this conversation. I was supposed to come on at 8, had some tech difficulties with the re-up of the computer and all that lovely stuff, but just a little bit of tech problem now. I go with it back. Yesterday, I was rather tired, so I wasn't even trying to turn on the camera. Probably see I'm a little bit tired tonight, but we're back for chapter 6. So for those who are on the line, thank you for joining us. This is Lift Every Voice, the LEV project, an extension of Take Time to Heal. For those who may not be sure, like, why in the world is she reading? Like, is this reading Rainbow or something? Hold on for 1 second. I just dropped something. Sorry. Is this, if you're just tuning in or if you're following along, whatever happened to reading? Reading is so fundamental, and comprehension is necessary, and just that whole exchange is something that we're losing in this tech age. And back in the day, we used to sit on the floor. You used to be in school when you were very much younger, and everybody sat around for story time. Well, that's kind of what we're doing. We're not waiting to February to begin to look into the history that is so ready and ever present, because it's here. And what we're doing is reading the narratives. What we're doing is reading. If you see me shaking my head, that's the babies. That's why sometimes. And what we're doing is reading the narratives. And at this point, we're reading 50 Years in Change. This you can get online for free. I have the link connected in the box. And if you missed the chapters before, feel free to read it. So far, we're reading a story of Charles Ball, and very interesting story. Just to be able to connect. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this project is because reading increases our ability to have some understanding of other people's experiences, namely in this case, our foreparents who came before us. And it also helps to dispel a lot of generalities, you know, stereotypical things that even we as a people of melanin like to do, like say stuff like slavery. And it's just this big, huge quilt that you just put over the whole thing. And it's very ambiguous and vague. And, like, name me somebody except for Harriet Tubman, quick. And they're like, So this gives a face to a name, to an experience, to helping in the process of learning what happened so that we can begin to understand why it is that we see what we see today. So today, we don't have any volunteers. With the volunteers, feel free to send me an inbox or just drop me a message if you would like to read. I had a whole lot of volunteers, but I know we're back in the middle of the week, and so maybe we don't have a whole lot of volunteers today. And so I'm going to put this camera, I'm looking a little sleepy right now. I'm going to be reading. Give me 2 seconds, because sometimes you need a little water in the process. And we're going to be reading from chapter 6. We're going to read one chapter and discuss, and then we'll go on to chapter 7 and the following day. So give me 1 more second, and we will go back and get started. Yeah, I need that water. Sorry about that. And so we are just getting started. Once again, sorry for the delay. So chapter 7, again, if you're wondering, the link is in the box. It's also on the social media if you're coming in from social media. So you can definitely follow along. He says, by the laws of the United States, I am still a slave. And though I am now growing old, I might even yet be deemed of sufficient value to be worth pursuing as far as my present residence. If those to whom the law gives the right of dominion over my person and life knew where to find me. For these reasons, I have been advised by those whom I believe to be my friends not to disclose the true names of any of those families in which I was a slave in Carolina or Georgia, lest this narrative should meet their eyes and in some way lead them to a discovery of my retreat. So I'm guessing he ran away while he's writing this. I was now the slave of one of the most wealthy planters in Carolina, who planted cotton, rice, indigo, corn, and potatoes, and was the master of 260 slaves. The description of one great cotton plantation will give a correct idea of all others, and I shall here present an outline of that of my master's. He lived about 2 miles from the Kagari River, which bordered his estate on one side, and in the swamps of which were his rice fields. The country hereabout is very flat. The banks of the river are low, and in wet season large tracts of country are flooded by the water of the river. Superabundant water of the river. There are no springs, and the only means of procuring water on the plantation is from wells, which must be sunk in general about 20 feet deep before a constant supply of water can be obtained. My master had two of these wells on his plantation, one at the mansion house and one at the quarter. My master's house was of brick. Brick houses are by no means common among the planters, whose residences are generally built of framework, weatherboarded with pine boards and covered with shingles of the white cedar or juniper cypress, and contain two large parlors and a spacious hall or entry on the ground floor. The main building was 2 stories high, and attached to this was a smaller building, 1.5 stories high, with a large room where the family generally took breakfast, with a kitchen at the farther extremity from the main building. There was a spacious garden behind the house, containing, I believe, about 5 acres, well cultivated and handsomely laid out. In this garden grew a great variety of vegetables, some of which I have never seen in the market of Philadelphia. It contained a profusion of flowers, 3 different shrubberies, a vast number of ornamental and small fruit trees, and several small hot houses with glass roofs. There was a head gardener who did nothing but attend to this garden through the year. And during the summer, he generally had 2 men and 2 boys to assist him. In the months of April and May, his garden was one of the sweetest and most pleasant places that I was ever in. At one end of the main building was a small house called the library, in which my master kept his books and papers, and where he spent much of his time. At some distance from the mansion was a pigeon house, and near the kitchen was a large wooden building called the kitchen quarter, in which the house servants slept, and where they generally took their meals. Here also the washing of the family was done, and all the rough or unpleasant work of the kitchen department, such as cleaning and salting fish, putting up pork, etc., was assigned to this place. There was no barn on this plantation, according to the exception of the word barn in Pennsylvania, but there was a wooden building about 40 feet long called a coach house, in one end of which the family carriage and the chaise in which my master rode were kept. Under the same roof was a stable large enough to contain 12 horses. In one end, the corn intended for the horses was kept, and the whole of one loft was occupied by the blades and tops of corn. About a quarter of a mile from the dwelling house were the huts of cabins of the plantation slaves standing in rows. There was 38 of them, generally about 16 feet square, and provided with pine floors. In these cabins were 250 people of all ages, sexes, and sizes. A short distance from the cabins was the house of the overseer. In one corner of his garden stood a corn crib and provision house. A little way off stood the house containing the cotton gin. There was no smokehouse, nor any place for curing meat. And while I was on this plantation, no food was ever salted for the use of the slaves. I went out into the garden, and after sundown, my old master sent me to the overseer's house. He was just coming in from the field and followed by a great number of black people. He asked me my name and calling a middle-aged man who was passing us at some distance, told him he must take me to live with him. I followed my new friend to his cabin, which was the shelter of his wife and 5 children. I can't. He just moved people in their house. I followed my new friend to his cabin, which was the shelter of his wife and 5 children. Their only furniture consisted of a few blocks of wood for seats, a short bench, small pine board, which served as a table, and small bed in one corner, composed of a mat made of common brushes spread upon some corn husks, pulled and split into fine pieces, and kept together by a narrow slip of wood confined to the floor by wooden pins. There was a common iron pot standing beside the chimney, and several wooden spoons and dishes hung against the wall. Several blankets also hung against the wall upon wooden pins. An old box made of pine boards without either lock or hinges occupied one corner. At the time I entered his humble abode, the mistress was not at home. She had not yet returned from the field, having been sent, as the husband informed me, with some other people late in the evening to do some work in a field about 2 miles distant. I found a child about a year old laying on the mat bed, and a little girl about 4 years old sitting beside it. These children were entirely naked, and when we came to the door, the oldest rose from its place and ran to its father, clasping him around. How you got the children running around naked? Clasping him around one of his knees, said, "Now we shall get good supper." The father laid his hand upon the head of his naked child and stood silently looking in its face, which was turned upwards toward his own for a moment, and then turning to me, said, "Did you leave any children at home?" The scene before me, the question propounded, and the manner of this poor man and his child caused my heart to swell until my breast seemed too small to contain it. My soul fled back upon the wings of fancy to my wife's lowly dwelling in Maryland, where I had been so often met on Saturday evening, when I paid them my weekly visit, by my own little ones who clung to my knees for protection and support, even as the poor little wretch now before me seized upon the weary limb of his hapless and destitute father, hoping that, naked as he was, for he too was naked, save only the tattered remains of a pair of old trousers, he would bring with his return at evening its customary scanty supper. I was unable to reply, but stood motionless, leaning against the walls of the cabin. My children seemed to fleet by the door in the dusky twilight, and the twittering of a swallow, which the moment fluttered over my head, sounded in my ear as the infantile teetering of my own little boy. But on a moment's reflection, I knew that we were separated without the hope of ever meeting, that they no more heard the welcome tread of my feet, and could never again receive the little gifts with which, poor as I was, I accustomed to present them. I was far from the place of my nativity, in a land of strangers, with no one to care for me beyond the care that a master bestows upon his ox. With all my future life one long, with all my future life one long, waste, barren desert of cheerless, hopeless, lifeless slavery, to be varied only by the pangs of hunger and the stings of the lash. For those who've just joined us, we're listening to the sixth chapter of 50 Years and Change, the life of an American slave, the true story of Charles Ball. If you would like to join along or read along, you can go online and click on the link that's in the box. If you can give me just one moment, I will continue. Sorry about that. Where am I? My if you would like to read, also feel free to let me know, and we can do that too. Let me go ahead and click over and make sure I'm not missing anyone. Oh, come on, Ivana. I'm still live, hopefully. Sorry about that. I clicked the wrong thing. It's just one of them days. All right. My reverie was at length broken by the appearance of the mother of the family with her 3 eldest children. The mother wore an old ragged shift, but the children, the eldest of whom appeared to be about 12, and the youngest 6 years old, were quite naked. When she came in, the husband told her that the overseer had sent me to live with them, and that she and her oldest child, who was a boy, immediately set about preparing their supper by boiling some of the leaves of the weeds called lamb's quarter in the pot. This, together with some cakes of cold corn bread, formed their supper. My supper was brought to me from the house of the overseer by a small girl, his daughter. It was a half-pound of bread cut from a loaf made of cornmeal. My companions gave me a part of their boiled greens, and we all sat down together to my first meal in my new habitation. I had no other bed than the blanket which I had brought with me from Maryland, and I went to sleep in the loft of the cabin which was assigned to me as my sleeping room, and in which I continued to lodge as long as I remained on this plantation. The next morning I was waked at the break of day by the sound of horn, which was blown very loudly. Perceiving that it was growing light, I came down and went out immediately in front of the house of the overseer, who was standing near his own gate, blowing the horn. In a few minutes, the whole of the working people from all the cabins were assembled, and as it was now light enough for me to see such objects as were about me, I at once perceived the nature of the servitude to which I was in future to be subject. So now he about to be introduced to his work. 1 second, please. The babies is turned up. For those who've just joined us, this is the LEV project. I'm a real mommy, so you already know how it goes. I have to talk to the children. They turned up over there, and you know how it is. Praise be to the Most High. As I have before stated, there were altogether on this plantation 260 slaves, but the number was seldom stationary for a single week. Births were numerous and frequent, and deaths were not uncommon. When I joined them, I believe we counted in all 263, but of these, only 170 went to the field to work. The others were children too small to be of any service as laborers, old and blind persons, or incurable diseased. 10 or 12 were kept about the mansion house and garden, chosen for the most handsome and springingly of the gang. I think about 168 assembled, man, this morning. At the sound of the horn, 2 or 3, being sick, sent word to the overseer that they could not come. The overseer wrote something on a piece of paper and gave it to his little son. This I was told was a note to be sent to our master to inform him that some of the hands were sick, it not being any part of the duty of the overseer to attend a sick Negro. The overseer then led off to the field with his horn in one hand and his whip in the other, we following, men, women, children, promiscuously, and a wretched looking troop we were. There was not an entire garment amongst us. More than half of the gang were entirely naked. Several young girls who had arrived at puberty wearing only the livery with which nature had ornamented them, and a great number of lads of an equal or superior age appeared in the same costume. There were neither bonnet, cap, nor headdress of any kind amongst us, except the old straw hat that I wore and which my wife had made for me in Maryland. This I soon laid aside to avoid the appearance of singularity, and as owing to the severe treatment I had endured whilst traveling in chains, and being compelled to sleep on the naked floor without undressing myself, my clothes were quite worn out. Sorry about that. Where were we? More than half the gang, all right. He says here, I'll go back. This I soon laid aside to avoid the parents of singularity. And as owing to the severe treatment I had endured whilst traveling in chains and being compelled to sleep on the naked floor without undressing myself, my clothes were quite worn out. I did not make a much better figure than my companions, though still I preserved the semblance of clothing so far that it could be seen that my shirt and trousers had once been distinct and separate garments. Not one of the others had on even the remains of two pieces of apparel. Some of the men had old shirts and some ragged trousers, but no one wore both. Almost amongst the women, several wore petticoats, and many had shifts. Not one of the whole number were both of these vestments. We walked nearly a mile through one vast cotton field before we arrived at the place of our intended day's labor. At last, the overseer stopped at the side of the field and, calling to several of the men by name, ordered them to call their companies and turn into their roles. The work we had to do today was to hoe and weave cotton for the last time, and the men whose names had been called and who were, I believe, 11 in number, were designated as captains, each of whom had under his command a certain number of the other hands. The captain was the foreman of his company, and those under his command had to keep up with him. Each of the men and women had to take one row, and don't do that. Sorry, where was I? Each of the men and women had to take one row and two, and in some cases where they were very small, three of the children had one. The first captain, whose name was Simon, took the first row, and the other captains were compelled to keep up with him. By this means, the overseer had nothing to do but to keep Simon hard at work, and he was certain that all the others must work equally hard. Simon was a stout, strong man, apparently about 35 years of age, and for the reason unknown to me, I was ordered to take a row next to his. The overseer with his whip in his hand walked about the field after us to see that our work was well done. As we worked with hoes, I had no difficulty in learning how the work was to be performed. The field of cotton at this season of the year are very beautiful. The plants among which we worked this day were about 3 feet high and in full bloom, with branches so numerous that they nearly covered the whole ground, leaving scarcely space enough between them to permit us to move about and work with our hoes. About 7 o'clock in the morning, the overseer sounded his horn, and we all repaired to the shade of some persimmon tree, which grew in a corner of the field to get our breakfast. I here saw a cart drawn by a yoke of oxen, driven by an old black man, nearly blind. The cart contained 3 barrels filled with water and several large baskets full of cornbread that had been baked in the ashes. The water was for us to drink, and the bread was our breakfast. The little son of the overseer was also in the cart and had brought with him the breakfast of his father in a small wooden bucket. The overseer had bread, butter, cold ham, and coffee for his breakfast. Ours was composed of corn cake, weighed about 3/4 of a pound to each person, with as much water as was desired. I at first supposed that this bread was dealt out to the people as their allowance, but on further inquiry, I found this not to be the case. Simon, by whose side I was now at work, and who seemed much pleased with my agility and diligence in my duty, told me here told me that here, as well as everywhere in this country, each person received a peck of corn at the crib door every Sunday evening, and that every person received, where am I? Simon, by whose side I was okay. Evening, and that in ordinary times, everyone had to grind his corn and bake it for him or herself, making such use of it as the owner thought proper. But that for some time past, the overseer, for the purpose of saving the time which had been lost in baking the bread, had made it the duty of an old woman who was not capable of doing much work in the field to stay at the quarter and bake the bread of the whole gang. When baked, it was brought to the field in a cart, and I saw and dealt out in loaves. They still had to grind their own corn after night, and as there were only 3 hand mills on the plantation, he said they experienced much difficulty in converting their corn into meal. We worked in this field all day, and at the end of every hour or hour and a quarter, we had permission to go to the cart, which was moved about the field so as to be near us and get water. Our dinner was the same in all aspects as our breakfast, except that in addition to bread, we had a little salt and a radish for each person. We were not allowed to rest at either breakfast or dinner longer than while we were eating, and we worked in the evening as long as we could distinguish the weeds from the cotton plants. Simon informed me that formerly, when they baked their own bread, they had left their work soon after sundown to go home and bake for the next day. But the overseer had adopted the new policy for the purpose of keeping them at work until dark. When we could no longer see to work, the horn was again sounded, and we returned home. I had now lived through one of the days, a succession of which make up the life of a slave on a cotton plantation. As we went out in the morning, I observed several women who carried their young children in their arms to the field. These mothers laid their children at the side of the fence or under the shade of the cotton plants while they were at work. And when the rest of us went to get water, they would go to give their children suck to their children, requesting someone to bring them water in gourds, which they were careful to carry to the field with them. One young woman did not like the others. One young woman did not like the others leave her child at the end of the row, but contrived a sort of rude knapsack made of a piece of coarse live cloth, in which she fastened her child, which was very young, upon her back, and in this way carried it all day and performed her task at the hoe with the other people. I pitied her, and we were going home at night, escorted her and learned her history. She had been brought up a lady's maid and knew little of hardship until she was sold south by a dissipated master. On this plantation, she was obliged to marry a man she did not like and was often severely whipped because she could not do as much work as the rest. I was affected by her story, and the overseer's horn interrupted our conversation, at hearing which she explained, "We are too late, let us run, or we shall be whipped." And setting off as fast as she could run, she left me alone. I quickened my pace and arrived in a crowd a moment before her. That's the end of the reading of chapter 6. Chapter 7 is coming up next. Sorry for all the noises. Babyville over here. If anybody has anything to say, if they would like to comment on the reading of chapter 6, feel free to do so at this time. I notice we have a lot of people who listen to it on the replay. So if you have anything to say on the replay, if you listen to this on the replay, then feel free to just put your comments in the box, and we'll address them the next show. Or if it's a question, or if it's a comment, or whatever the case may be, just feel free to interact. Sorry. I just thought it was interesting. Like I said, he gives a very descriptive. He's very descriptive, so he kind of lets you walk where he's walking and see what he's seeing, and the way he describes it, like I said, it's just very, 3D television. He's very 3D in his description. But what stood out to me was the end, because I've been doing some research on women in slavery. And so he confirmed one of the things that they said, that often the women took the children with them to the field. And as he stated, they would leave them at the end of the row, and some would put them on their back. And he said his heart, he was seeing this and his heart bled, just to see such a young child taken out in the heat of the day, because you really had to go to work. There's some sources that say in a few weeks after giving birth, you were subject to go back to the field. And the testimony here, she's saying that you would be whipped if you couldn't do as much. The expectations, when anybody knows about going into birth and pregnancy, it takes a while for your womb to go back in place. And if you do any hard labor or heavy lifting during that period, you could cause prolapse uterus, you can cause serious reproductive issues. And as you do more research on women in slavery, there were a lot of reproductive issues because of the heavy labor that they were under right up until giving birth, as well as soon thereafter. Oftentimes, on some plantations, not all, we see records of taking the child off the breast, especially if they took that mother's milk and gave it to the European. She became the wet nurse of the European master slave children. So there's a whole lot of dynamics here that hopefully we're tuning into, so that we can begin to understand, or even begin to heal from some of the injuries that our foreparents have sustained. There's a lot of research coming out now, things such as epigenetics and research that's saying you can definitely still be struggling or grappling with the experiences of your foreparents passed down to you through your genetic coding. This is something that we knew to a certain degree, but now they're putting a name on it, and it makes perfect sense. You have predisposed phobias and predisposed fears. It doesn't mean that you're typecasted in it. It just means that you have an inclination towards certain things based on what you were given as, let's say, a genetic inheritance. And so, our foreparents, being that they went through certain things like starvation, where a lot of people, because they look at the sustenance of the diet: cornbread, 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 and more cornbread. I know earlier, before in the previous chapters, he was talking about cornbread and fat batter and cornbread and lard. And when we go to certain places in the South, and you see a lot of people still predisposed to that diet, one that was given them not out of luxury, but out of you know, necessity, quote unquote, from the slave master. Another thing that stuck out to me, and is that they didn't have any clothes on his particular plantation. Many reports that I'm reading saying that slaves would only get clothes twice a year, but they had, he said, over 263 slaves. And in those days, there wasn't Walmart or Target. So the cotton that they was picking, they had to, pick the cotton. They had to card it. They said they had to spin it into thread, and then they had to put it on the loom and weave it. And so imagine what it was to clothe all of those people. And this particular slave master, like I said, not all, but this particular one who you're speaking about, didn't even clothe the people. So imagine the dignity that was taken away, the imagining the humbling state that the people were put in to have to walk around without clothes on. And I'm wondering if this was so for the winter time as well, because that also, it would be a bit strange to be walking around without any clothes on, children of 11, 12 years old, naked. I think he also took note of the overseer's breakfast. He made sure to take note. He was looking over there in that wooden in the wooden box, like, hold up, overseer, you got coffee, you got bread, you have all of these things, and we have cornbread and water. you know and so when you think about what's going on with quote unquote black people today, and for instance, I saw a comedic thing about the Powerball, and they were supposed to be comedy, but now as I'm reading these slave narratives, and I'm like, nah, I'm not really laughing. So the woman is like, if I win the Powerball, and she starts rattling off of all these things that she always wanted, or that the system has always said these are things of prestige, but now that I have the money, this is what I'm going to get. And oftentimes you see lottery winners, not only black, but those who did not work to get the money, spend it in ways that it went quicker than it came. And so when you think about all of the things that the slaves lacked, and then you, like I said before in another time, and you turn and look at the statistics on what quote unquote black Americans or people of color spend their money on, it's in all the areas that you have been deprived for over generation: clothes, food, and shelter. And those are statistics that they have performed. The next time I'm gonna actually get those statistics and bring them back and read them as I've been doing in my studies. That those are the things that the large majority. If somebody makes it big in the rap music game, the first thing they're gonna do is get a big house and a wardrobe. You understand what I'm saying? Because again, those were the essential basic things of life that in slavery and the time thereafter was lacking. And that is what is at the forefront of the mind. Oftentimes you don't get, inheritance. Oftentimes you don't get, the house that your father or your mother paid for. Oftentimes that's not what you get. You inherit debt, you inherit lack. And so because of that is the case, that's at the forefront of your mind. And we see that this specific system of slavery here in the West, not only in America, but right now we're reading about America, it created that deficit. It created that void. It created that gap. And so when we want to understand just a little bit about what's wrong with quote unquote Black people, like I'm saying, it's here if we'll take the time to look. So if anybody has anything to say, feel free to do so at this time. If not, we will pick up tomorrow to the under 12. I try to read one chapter a day, you know. We'll pick up tomorrow. And if you would like to read, just shoot me a message and then we'll definitely have you read. It's called Lift Every Voice. So we definitely want to hear every voice. So if you would like to read, let us know. We'll be on to chapter 7 to really see what happens to him. Also, what stuck out to me was the powerlessness of the father. That he had a family and he just threw somebody in the midst of their already lacking condition and just threw somebody in the midst of that, like, yo, this is your new cabin mate. At first I thought he was a bachelor, but now he's in there with it. And so you really had no choice in a lot of it. Oh, the slave man, his wife comes in and says, the slave master told, we got a new person in here. So you have your children, and that also shows where a lot of you see a lot of sexual inappropriateness in the Black community, in slavery in itself, from the European to the so-called Black community, as well as amongst one another. And these are some of the things that's coming out at this time. The boundary lines that were crossed. I'm thinking, what are the effects of oppressing a people in that degree and then having them exposed to one another on a consistency? And what kind of atmosphere or mentality or thought process did that procreate for people to then turn around and say, you know what, you're promiscuous? I just want to say, in this context, when they're using it, what I learned in context of slave narratives, promiscuous is not what it means today. It's more like it was just a mixture of men and women. So if they say we sat promiscuously, or it doesn't mean that they were doing inappropriate acts. It just means that, it was a mix. It wasn't a singular audience, singularly male or singularly female. It was a mixed audience. That's what I learned the way, because, as time goes on, people use words differently. So in this space and time, they use the word to mean basically we were speaking, or we walked in a mixed audience. One more thing I would like to point out is that as it relates to the Black woman and the Black man, the so-called Black woman and Black man and child, the Black woman did not have the ability to be at home, as we're reading here. She was in the field right next to him. So, that's another topic for another day, but it's just something to note that she was right there. She was in the labor. As a matter of fact, he came home early and she went 2 miles. I don't know if you heard that part. She was 2 miles off finishing up some work with some other people on another plot before they came home. So, being out and working has always been, from this institution, something that the women did. And it doesn't say it was good. It doesn't say it was bad. In this case, I was just making note that both of them were out there during this backbreaking labor. So I'm look forward to see. I'm not reading ahead, so I definitely look forward to see what happens in chapter 7. Once again, thank you for tuning in. This has been another edition of the Lift Every Voice and read the LEV project. So till next time, my name is Amuna Yisrael. I pray everybody have a blessed evening. Shalom.